welcome. So I hope you're all able to see me with the 2 megapixels that my laptop provides. I am Graham Bettinson. I am the Discovery Programme Officer for the South Devon Rivers. So this is the first in the South Devon Rivers video series, webinar series, sorry, the video series is something else. You will all currently be muted. You're able to interact with me, with myself, using the buttons on the right of your screen, and you can pose questions to me, which I will try to answer to the best of my ability at the end of the webinar. So the presentation will be around 20 to 25 minutes with time for questions at the end. So for the first in the series, we thought we would bring you details on the abandoned hulks and boats present at Old Mill Creek on the River Dart. So now this might be the oddest point at which I have decided to present information on a site, because this is a program of work and research that is halfway through the process of being studied. However, it seemed like a very well-timed webinar, as pre-COVID, we were planning to start serving the vessels next week with a mixture of Southampton students and local volunteers. Something we are very keen to still do, and that I will get to at the end. So you will have to forgive me, as some of the work and research is still ongoing, and as you will see as we go through them, there is lots of juicy tangents and potential avenues of research developing from the work. So if you know any more information on any of the vessels mentioned, we would love to hear from you. Okay, so before we get into this properly, I thought I'd just quickly run through some background for those of you that are not familiar with the Citizen project. So Citizen stands for Coastal and Intertidal Zone Archaeological Network. It's all about working with local volunteers. It's all about working with local communities and volunteers to help record, communicate, and raise awareness of coastal and intertidal archaeology prior to its inevitable loss due to climate change. So Citizen had an initial phase which ran from 2015 to 2018. We are now into the second phase from 2019 to 2021. In this phase, we have focused our attention into 6 discovery program areas. There are 2 up in the north, 2 in the southwest, 2 in the southeast, sorry, and 2 in the southwest, one of which is the South Devon Rivers. So the South Devon Rivers Discovery Program area is one of the largest discovery programs, and it runs all the way from Sidmouth up on the top right, all the way down to Wembury on the bottom left. So we concentrate our work around the Exe, the Dart, and the Dart. Although we do concentrate our work around the Exe, the Tean, and the Dart in the Discovery Programme, the Discovery Programme does also include the Yelm, the Avon, the and the Kingsbridge Estuary, and all that coastline in between, just for good measure. It's an area that's famous for its rocky wrecking coastline, historical national and international trade, various maritime industries, and its historic connection to the sea. As you can see from the image, the Dart is bang smack in the middle. The Dart River is bang smack in the middle of our Discovery Programme area. So the Dart River begins up in Dartmoor and runs down into the sea at Dartmouth and Kingswear. The bit we are interested in as Citizen is all the way up to Totnes, and more specifically Totnes Weir, which marks the tidal boundary of the river. The river has an incredibly rich history and was a highly active river for trade and industry. And then in the latter half of the 20th century, it becomes more about yachts than trade, although small boatyards and shipyards are still present. So now onto the ships. So humans have always loved dumping stuff in estuaries. In all the tidal reaches around all the rivers in the UK, you will find some kind of abandoned vessel for a number of reasons. These reasons range from the hulking process, which is a process by which a vessel is stripped of propulsion and repurposed until it ceases to be of use, to one of the more common reasons, which is good intentions gone wrong. And that is where a vessel has been beached onto somewhere to convert it or to work upon it, usually to convert it into a houseboat. The vessel's fallen into disrepair, and the owner has run out of money or died, and the vessel becomes abandoned. So why do we study abandoned vessels? So the reason we study them is that they give us a very unique insight into the working practices, events, and most importantly, allow us to communicate the stories, industries, and lives of that place. So the study of vessels often gives us the last chance to investigate ground truth and demonstrate those narratives before the vessel deteriorates beyond recognition. So anyway, enough, sorry, I just had to check it moved on. Anyway, so enough of that. So the map you can see is in no way, sorry, it's that one. Sorry, there's a problem with PowerPoint there. So The map you can see is in no way a representation of all the abandoned vessels on the River Dart. The remains the ones I have the most information on, and it's been built out of the infamous lost ships of the West Country, the work of the Kingswear historians, and previous archaeology work conducted by the Maritime Archaeology Trust as part of their Forgotten Wrecks of the First World War program. So Old Mill Creek is located here, and as you can see, it is a significant concentration of abandoned vessels. I'm going to first go through the ones we know a fair amount about, and then move on to the ones we don't know so much about and how we are going to investigate them. So, Old Mill Creek, as you can see here, marks the parish boundary between Dartmouth and Dittersham. A mid-13th century deed mentions a tide mill within Dartmouth, and that is one of the earliest references to a tide mill in the country. So Old Mill Creek, unlike a lot of the foreshores in the UK, is owned entirely down to the mean low water mark by the Raleigh estate. And the Raleigh estate have been fantastic in allowing us to do this work and helping us along our way in the ongoing work on the vessels. I also have to give a huge thank you to Dave and his father John Diston, who own a boatyard in the creek and have provided fantastic local knowledge as they have been working in Devon and on the Dart for 3 generations. Firstly, originally as boat breakers and now boatyard owners. So historically, the area known as Old Mill Creek and the area known as Rough Hole Point, which I'll get to in a bit, has been used to dump, store and break boats for generations by Dartmouth Harbour and other people. The creek is home to a collection of vessels largely related to the 19th and 20th century. You will see as we go through the vessels and what we currently know, they give us a unique insight into the history of the Dart and the wider Devon landscape. Okay, so to make this easy for myself, I've decided to go from left to right, and we'll be starting with the unusual tale of the paddle steamer Dartmouth Castle, which is located opposite Ditson's boatyard at Creekside Boatyard. Okay, so on the River Dart, there are 3 paddle steamers, the remains of 3 paddle steamers on the River Dart. 2 of these paddle steamers are connected to the River Dart Steamboat Company, who operated from the 1850s through to the 1970s, and they operated ferrying people around the River Dart. To do this, they used very distinctive purpose-built paddle steamers. And just to make things a little bit confusing, the vessels use successive names. So there is the original paddle steamer Dartmouth Castle, and there is a second paddle steamer Dartmouth Castle. The one we're interested in, is the second paddle steamer Dartmouth Castle, which was launched in 1907. This is an image of just as it started to work. So back to my original point about the 2 paddle steamers connected to the River Dart Steamboat Company. So the first one you'll probably all be aware of, which is the first Kingswear Castle, and that is laid up at Fleet Mill Quay near Totnes and Stoke Gabriel. The remains can be seen very easily on a boat, and if you haven't seen it already, there is a little video on our YouTube channel that goes through the details of that vessel. So the second, the one we're interested for this talk, is the paddle steamer Dartmouth Castle, and that is believed to form part of the river wall at Old Mill Creek. So as I said, it was built in 1907, and then during the Second World War, she was laid up at Old Mill Creek for the duration of the war, and then never returned to service. In 1947, she was stripped of her engines and became a landing stage, so she went through that hulking process. So I originally dismissed this as it must have been removed. So the image you can see is from a book written in the 1980s. I originally dismissed it. However, from conversations during isolation with Diston's boatyard, it would appear that the remains possibly are still there and are now behind a modern quay wall. So I am now making efforts to see if I can head down there and see if this is true. So it was remarked in 1980 in a book called Lost Ships, the West Country, that the ship was hard aground, ballasted and half grown over with soil, and the paddle wheels were still in position. So that's a fascinating tangent for us. So the paddle steamers of the River Dart Steamboat Company were known to have a shallow draft to allow them to work on the Dart. They're specifically built for the Dart River. So the paddle steamer Dartmouth Castle could be distinguished from the others because it had a slightly smaller passenger capacity and a different wheelhouse and a narrower deck, and they are all diagnostic features that we may be able to prove. So just to go on a slight tangent, there is another paddle steamer that is still afloat, which is the second Kingswear Castle. And that ship amazingly ties into Old Mill Creek as well. So the second Kingswear Castle, the one that's currently afloat and is on many a postcard, That one was refloated in 2014 and was restored in the sheds behind the person stood on top of that vessel. Okay, so second up, we have the Mizpah. So the Mizpah is down there on the bottom left. I would not try to get to this one. There is a path down to a little hermitage castle, which is a little folly in Old Mill Creek, and you can just see the remains from there. The mud is incredibly deep, and I wouldn't suggest it. If you do want to have a look at it, I would suggest going from the riverside on a kayak or a paddleboard at high tide. So the Mizpah is a small ketch, which is a small two-masted fore and aft rigged sailing boat. The Mizpah is believed to have been used to moor barrage balloons during the Second World War. The vessel was built just prior to the turn of the 20th century. The vessel was engaged in general trading until it was purchased by the Langmead family of Glampton. And this amazingly ties it into another abandoned vessel on the River Dart. So this image is of the vessel remains in the 1980s. And then the vessel it ties into is the Effort. So the remains of the Effort are up here, just center of the screen highlighted. So as I said, the Effort and the Mizpah were both ketches, and they're now both located on the River Dart, and they were both owned by the Langmead family, and they were used to deliver sand and gravel from the Dart to Torquay. So here you can see the vessels as they were, working together in Torquay Harbour. So there's a lovely section in the Trust report where they looked at these vessels that details the story of the Effort and how it ended up where it is. So I won't spend too much time on it. So the one thing that does come out of it is where we kind of lose knowledge. So the last record we have for one of these for these vessels in 1938, the Effort and the Mizpah were put up for sale by the Langmead family, and then we kind of lose knowledge for a bit, which is fairly common when it comes to ships. More research needs to be done. And then we lose knowledge until the Second World War. And in the Second World War, the Effort is known to be used as a balloon barrage vessel tether in the Dart. Not in the Dart, sorry. Balloon barrage tether in the Dart, and it is presumed that the Mizpah was also used for that purpose. Another tale of the Mizpah is a weird one, and I really want to find out what happened here. So another tale of the Mizpah is that in the 1980s, there was an exhibition at the National Maritime Museum, and they removed the pump and the windlass from the Mizpah for that exhibition. So again, I'm going to try and look into this over the course of the year, but if you went to that exhibition, please tell me how they used it, and I would love to know what it was used for. Okay, so this is the Effort today, and as you can see from this image, the two vessels are very similar, and we may be able to compare the two using the Trust survey and some possible follow-up survey from ourselves to draw out more information. One of the fascinating things that is mentioned in a few of the reports is that there is alterations made so that the vessels can be balloon barrage tethers. Now, if we are able to find any trace of those alterations, we may be able to shed more light on that element of their history. Okay, so when you compare the two vessels, as you can see, these are the remains of the Mizpah from aerial photography. You can see it's in a lot better condition. So there's actually two vessels here. The one on the right is believed to be the Mizpah. The one on the left we don't have a name for. As you can see, it's in fairly complete condition with most of the hull intact and most of the deck features still identifiable. This may be in part due to how difficult it is to access. From a quick recce with my colleague in Therese in 2019, the mud is incredibly thick and the overhanging branches make a drone nearly impossible for the survey. So the survey might be quite difficult. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. So for the survey, it will likely be a mixture of general measurements taken at high tide from the riverside, using kayaks or paddle boards or a little rib, and then a photogrammetric survey using the very high tech, and you may have seen maritime archaeologists use before, GoPro on a stick or SLR on a stick, depending on how brave I feel. And then possibly, if we find a very brave student volunteer, or I'm feeling particularly brave, we might try and do an RTK survey as well. And RTK is a very fancy and accurate GPS. Okay, so I think you can probably get the idea the idea now of how a lot of these vessels are incredibly interconnected into one another, and how they are able to give us the context of the river at those times. Now we're going to move up to the concentration on the top right and go through those vessels. So just to talk about studying hulks. So studying hulks is a little bit like trying to work out a jigsaw where someone has stolen the box, half the pieces, and in this case, that someone is the sea and a mixture of humans over the years. Now, many archival and historical information refers to these vessels when they were in good enough shape that you were able to easily identify them, sometimes able to read the actual name off the ship and give a kind of rough location. As you can imagine, identifying ships gets even more difficult and complex when you start looking at areas where there are multiple vessels, and as they deteriorate, you are usually only left with the keel and some elements of the framing. So what we do to investigate and work out the identity of vessels is we comb through historical accounts, reports, and discussions with locals to identify diagnostic features on specific vessels and specific vessel types. And then we try and match those to the site itself through survey to see if we can clarify one vessel from another. So these are things like general length and beam, and then how many masts, and by extension the mast steps, what propulsion the vessel has and how that would have affected its construction, if it was refitted, etc., etc. So the next area is one of these places. So this area is known as Rough Hole Point, and it's been used historically to work on, store, and abandon boats. So, as I said previously, it's been famously used to work on and store boats, and a convenient location being so close to Dartmouth, and has been used by Dartmouth Harbour as well. The area is known as Rough Hole Point and Rough Hole Mudflats. So whilst I was in isolation, I should also mention the area has also been used by Distance when they were boat breakers. So whilst I was in isolation, I started talking to Dave Ditson and his father John, who is 97, who remembers breaking a few of these vessels, which is an incredible link to have. And he's also able to retell stories from his father. As I said previously, they've been working here for 3 generations and originally were boat breakers. So I'm hoping to interview John and Dave in person once we're out of isolation, to capture these stories on boat breaking on the Dart in general, and then see if we can glean anything from his memory and past stories to help us with our work. So there are multiple vessels present and mentions of many different vessels in the historic archives, and at different points, various different points for history. The problem is, as a ship deteriorates, it only becomes a keel and a frame, and then working out which vessel is which becomes quite difficult. So Rough Hole Creek is where we are going into the next vessel, which is the Winifred. So the Winifred, which is on the right, is a small 38-ton ketch, and it was built in Falmouth in 1897. So it operated along the south coast, plying as a merchant trader between the ports of Cornwall and Hampshire. So during the Second World War, Winifred was one of these vessels that, again, interconnectedness with boats. The Winifred was one of the vessels that was employed on the Falmouth balloon barrage. So it kind of ties into the effort in the Mizpah. So it was reportedly servicing the other barrage vessels with the gas bottles. So in that way, it's also got a nice little shared history with the Mizpah. So after this mention of it during the Second World War, we don't have a lot of information. So how it became a charred hulk at this place, we're not really sure. The most likely conclusion was that it had been towed here for likely houseboat conversion. So it again comes back to the idea of good intentions gone wrong. Okay. So this vessel has been looked at previously by the Maritime Archaeology Trust, who recorded many of its features. You can see in the image an inkling of one of its mast steps. I didn't bother to clean it, I'm afraid. And then in the image, you can also see the likely remains of the ship's water tank. So like many sailing vessels of this era in the late 20th century, she at some point was fitted with an auxiliary engine. So in the trust report, there is the mention of an iron knee, and that is a nice diagnostic feature that gives you the height of the deck. So since that knee was recorded in 2015, it is now completely gone, and it kind of gives you a demonstration of how quickly some of these vessels start to deteriorate and we lose that information. So what I'm keen to achieve here is to establish a very robust baseline level of data. So we now have more visual and more accurate methods than we have ever had in maritime archaeology. So what we will do here is aim to collect a full RTK survey of the site and all its features for comparison to previous surveys. And then we will create a 3D model using photogrammetry, which will allow us to monitor the site's deterioration, as well as create a nice public product that you'll be able to interact with, and allows us to tell the story of the Winifred, but also the story of these types of vessels, which are a fairly typical South Coast trader. Okay, now I am going to mess up my order slightly and jump straight over to another vessel just on the top right, which is the Six Brothers, mainly because this demonstrates the classic hulked vessel. So the Six Brothers, this is the potential site of the Six Brothers. The Six Brothers is launched in 1897 or 1898. It is again a ketch-rigged fishing vessel, having a gross tonnage of around 49 tons. So the Six Brothers was one of the typical popular types of small fishing vessel known as a mule-class trawler, and it operated out of Brixham. So in May 1929, there was a great little story that was found by the Trust's work on the Forgotten Wrecks project. And in May 1929, the ship was reported to have been purchased by Newfoundland Fishing Company and was due to be sailed by a Plymouth crew across to the Atlantic. However, when the crew actually arrived to sail the vessel, there was a for sale sign on it, and it would turn out that the engines had not been installed. The engines had been removed. So it would appear the owner never took ownership. So in that same year, the Six Brothers ceases fishing in its entirety. It's pretty difficult without an engine. And it is stripped and given low water legs in September 1929. So she was often, after that, used as a landing jetty and mooring point. So it kind of demonstrates that process of taking a fishing vessel and then turning it into a landing jetty. So again, with this site, it's all about setting up a baseline, but also seeing if we can confirm definitely that these remains here are the remains of the Six Brothers. There is a fair few vessels in the area that generally could fit, and the location is just a simple grid reference. And sometimes this is the most likely, but sometimes that doesn't prove it is. It would also be great, on a personal note, I would love to see if we can distinguish between the original vessel and the alterations that were made during the hulking process to give it those low tide legs. Okay, now on to one of my potential favorites. And I say potential because we haven't been able to get out there and clarify if it is or isn't the Mayflower. That was the plan for next week. So, and it also gives us a great opportunity. The next site gives us a great opportunity to compare one paddle steamer with one paddle steamer that was not made for the Dart River with one from the River Dart Steamboat Company that was. So this all started with a mention from the Lost Ships of the West Country. So Lost Ships of the West Country is almost a Bible for maritime archaeologists in the Southwest, and I am becoming its top salesman. So Lost Ships of the West Country was written in the 1980s and refers to a small iron steamer, reportedly with the remains of a paddle sponson on the foreshore, roughly dating it to around the 19th and 20th century. The book also has a note that locals in the area in 1980 believed that the steamer was abandoned here after a twilight service as a fever hulk. Now, this obviously gets you very interested, but it's the same claim that is made of the original Kingswear Castle that is abandoned up at Stoke Gabriel. So at first, I figured this may be confusion between the two paddle steamers. So I went digging, particularly at the outbreak of the coronavirus due to the relevance of it. So I went digging, and it turned out turned out I was wrong. There wasn't confusion between the two vessels, and I found a nice report on the history of hospital isolation ships on the Dart, which I was then able to collaborate with online records in the Dartmouth archives, and it would appear, oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Okay. And it would appear that both vessels were isolation hospital ships, which were colloquially referred to as fever hulks in their twilight years. So, and this one would appear to potentially be the Mayfly, which was known to be abandoned at Old Mill Creek for breaking by Ditsons. And then when I got in contact with John Ditson, he hinted that he may have a story related to this of his father breaking up the vessel that might give us something that we on the site. So just to go into the story of the hospital isolation ships. So between 1868 and 1870, there were frequent outbreaks of smallpox in Dartmouth, and it was believed that this disease, that the infection originated from visiting ships. So this gave rise to a report recommended that a hospital be built, and eventually in 1887, Dartmouth College Hospital is opened, but they did not have didn't have facilities for infectious disease. So plans for an isolation hospital were blocked by a local called Sir Henry Seal due to them being too close to his residence. So in 1893, an old paddle steamer called the Mayfly was bought in Liverpool and then fitted out as a hospital ship to accommodate 25 patients. She was moored opposite Dartmouth near the High Ferry originally. The patients came mainly from visiting boats, and whenever the Mayfly had a contagious occupant on board, they flew a yellow flag. So the Mayfly was little used by 1906, and condition had massively deteriorated. And then in 1909, she was moved to a new mooring site in Old Mill Creek, where she continued to deteriorate. And although it was recognised a new hospital ship was needed by the outbreak of World War I put a stop to those proceedings. So then, in November 1916, the Mayfly broke adrift in a gale and had to be rescued. And then after the First World War, a medical officer finally declares the boat unfit for human habitation. And in December 1923, a replacement was purchased and the Mayfly sold for breaking by Ditsons, probably here. And that's the bit we need to work out. So the replacement for the Mayfly as an isolation hospital ship was the first Kingswear Castle, the one that is abandoned up at Stoke Gabriel. So it had ceased to be a passenger ferry and then was converted to become an isolation hospital ship. And then in that new role, it was very short-lived. So it took on the role in 1923 and then only performed that duty up until 1927, where it was dumped at Stoke Gabriel at dumped near Stoke Gabriel at Fleet Mill Quay. Okay, so on this one, you're going to have to bear with us. So we need to conduct a full survey to be able to confirm or deny that this is the Mayfly. So at the moment, all I can say is this site is definitely a paddle steamer, and there are two other vessels nearby. There are two vessels here, and it might be either one. So I'm going to keep digging and see if I can't clarify it is the Mayfly, pulling out diagnostic features from the archives such as Lloyd's Register and local archives, whilst also collecting oral history to see if we can't clear this site up. So there is a chance it may be another vessel completely, but the connection between itself and the Kingswear Castle made it a great subject for a blog on fever hulks, which you can read on the Citizen website, and that's what inspired my further investigation of this site. Okay, so coming into the last but not least of vessels we know stuff about is the Invermore, which is a kind of my white whale, which is on the right of your screens. So the Invermore is a schooner. The Invermore was built in 1921 in Arklow in Ireland, and it's claimed to be the last wooden trading schooner built in the British Isles. The site is too far out to be surveyed safely on foot and can be clearly identified due to its intact winch. So the Invermore itself carried a mixed cargo and had a 36-year working life. And then in 1956, the vessel was withdrawn from service and was acquired by an emigration venture from Dartmouth to Australia. The venture fell through, and in 1965, due to unpaid harbour dues, which is another common cause for why vessels get abandoned, the vessel was towed to Rough Hole Point, where it now lays. So the vessel itself was pillaged by thieves. The helm, the spars, various engine bits mysteriously disappeared. And then, just for good measure, the National Maritime Museum finished the job by recovering the Windrop engine, presumably at the same time they did the Mizpah, but I do not know. So the Invermore Remains themselves is now at the mercy of the tides, and as you can see, it's rapidly deteriorating. The site is too far out to be safely surveyed on foot and can be clearly identified due to its intact winch, which is mentioned in many reports on the vessel. Now, we could survey this with a rib or a crack team of maritime archaeologists in waders, but there's no sense of community in that. So what we are using this site as a chance to do is explore the possibility of conducting surveys out on the water as well as when the tide is out. So this plan was sadly interrupted by COVID, but the plan is to use local kayakers and paddleboarders to go out and survey the site at high tide, collect measurements, affix targets and survey tags, and then at low tide, we'll use a drone to collect a series of images that will allow us to create a 3D model of the site. Now, on to the ones we don't know much about. So I'm sure the eagle-eyed people will have seen the amount of unknown hulks, multiple keels and frames, and unknown vessels that are on the maps that have been coming up on your screens. So, as I've said previously, famous place for dumping ships. There's also a really odd tangent to do with an armada ship, but we haven't got time to go into that. Getting into sites we have very little information on. So these are them up here. So this site is eroding out with each tide. So these images here were taken in June 2019, and as you can see various frames, possible linear feature with multiple frames and keels protruding from the foreshore. So there are two vessels either side of this roughly linear feature, and this has been tentatively interpreted as somewhere where there's boat breaking activity, but it warrants a lot more investigation. So now I've started digging into the archives and having conversations with Distance to see if these vessels are related to them, but also to see if we can start distinguishing them out. But this is not an easy task, and is where we need volunteers and students to essentially throw manpower at it. So to see if we can clarify what's going on here, we are currently running an initiative called Armchair Archaeology, where you can help us research these sites and others from your own home, and you can see the Citizen website for details on that program. That initiative. Survey-wise, the first thing we're going to have to do here is establish the number of vessels and then characterize them, may be able to link to archival records and typologies to distinguish them from each other. So now, what is next? So I think we've all had enough of making banana bread. The first thing we need to do is get out and start surveying again and see if we can't clear up what I think you'll have taken away from this is there's some fascinating stories here, but it's a rather messy image of this area and these vessels. So what we're planning on doing first is over the series of a few weekends, hopefully with the combination of students and volunteers, we will systematically go through the vessels and record them. So the most obvious thing we do need for that is volunteers and students. So if you're keen to get involved and sign up, you can sign up to our newsletter and keep an eye on the social medias for when we are back up and running on the foreshore. As you can imagine, field work is going to be slightly different, and I imagine we'll be working in much smaller groups, so these will book up quickly. Now, second, what is next? So what is next? Archaeology, at its core, due to the interest the public have in its past. So a standard archaeology report just does not cut it anymore, not in the days where we have more visual and communication methods than we ever have done. So what we will be doing is we'll also be creating some interactive digital content for public consumption that will bring together the 3D models that we'll generate through the surveys, the oral histories from working with the locals, various videos on what we're seeing and what we're identifying, and then draw together in the historical and archaeological information that we have collected and hopefully collaborated on with our volunteers. We have also been in tentative talks about putting on a display with the South Devon A&B in a local gallery. And that is it. So, just to finish off before the questions, by announcing the next webinar on the South Devon Rivers video series in 2 weeks' time. This will be from Anne-Marie Culhane and Joe Salter, who are going to talk to us about the Tidelines project. The Tidelines project is a project we're hoping to work with. The Tidelines project is a community project bringing together people of all ages along the estuary with academics and researchers to inspire and share learning across disciplines. So that can now be registered on the Citizen website via our events page. So massive thank you to all of you, and now on to the questions. Once we have finished the questions, you will get an evaluation form, and if you could fill that out, it's incredibly useful for us in our reporting. So yeah, I hope there is a few of you still there, and we'll get on to the questions.